Hello guys, this is Tafatzka from StackDev and welcome back. So in this tutorial, we are now want to look at how we can actually go ahead and write our unit testing. So for our unit testing, we are simply going to essentially go ahead and test all these components that we have developed so that our code will be actually testable, so that we'll go through each and every element and test it out. So for our testing, we are going to use React testing library and Jest. Right, so Jest is essentially a test runner that we're going to use. So to test your DOM, like I said, I'm going to use React testing library, but you can actually go ahead and there's so many testing libraries that you can use for your React, for example, Enzyme, which is the most popular one. So to get started, let's just quickly go ahead and go to our browser and go to the Jest website so that we can actually go ahead and quickly look at the dependencies that we need to install. So in this case, we have created our application using Webpack, so which means we didn't use create React app. So if you have used Babel 2, you actually need to add a couple of dependencies for your Jest testing environment to kick off. So in this case, let me just simply go ahead and copy this command. So these are the dependencies that we need to install. So let's simply go back to our VS Code, right? So once I've got to our VS Code, let me simply go ahead and paste this out. So in this case, what we want to install, we want to install something called React Test Renderer, right? So this one will be using it when we are now looking at writing unit testing for our snapshot tests. And also the Babel preset React, we had already installed this at the beginning of the tutorial, so we are not going to install it. And as well as the Babel preset, we are not going to install it as well. But the Babel Jest, we need it, and then the Jest as well. So here, let me just quickly remove this, right? So let me simply go ahead and say npm install, and I want to install them as development dependencies. So these are the the two packages that we want to install for our Jest. So let's simply go ahead and hit enter. So while this is still installing, let's simply go ahead and look at how we can actually go ahead and install the React testing library. So if you go back to the browser and we navigate below on the Jest website, under testing React apps, right? There's a couple of examples that you can see there, right? So one thing that you need to do before we install a React testing library is you need to configure your Babel, right? So which means we need to actually go ahead and create a file called babel.config.js and simply go ahead and configure our Babel so that we can actually go ahead and run our unit tests using our Jest and React test library. So let me simply go ahead and copy this, right? So it's called, let me simply copy everything, right? And let me simply go back to VS Code, right? So in my VS Code is still installing. So let me open a new terminal on my VS Code. Right, so in this case, I want to create a file called Babel, right, in my root repository of my project.config.js, right? So once I've created this file, this one, let me simply go ahead and paste the configurations that I had. So once you've done this, we are pretty much done. So let me close this up. And let me close this terminal as well, right? So our Jest has finished installing. This is what we need. So let's simply go ahead and install the last dependency that we need. So if you simply go back to our browser, on our documentation, we have configured Babel, right? So the next thing that we need is for our DOM testing, right? In this case, we're going to use React testing library. So you can also use Enzyme, you can also use React testing utils, but React testing library also comes with these test utils as well. So in this case, I'm going to install React testing library. So to install the React testing library, this is the command that we need. So let me simply go ahead and copy this command, right? And let's simply go back to our terminal, right? So let me simply go ahead and paste the command. So in this case, we want to install the React testing library. So let me simply go ahead and say npm install, right? Then I'll install it as a dev dependency as well, and I'll hit enter. So once you have installed all these packages, right, the next thing that we probably need to do is to lastly add the configuration for our package.json. So if I navigate to the browser and I actually go to let's see, right, under scripts here in our package.json file, we need to add this test script so that when we run the test command, Jest will actually be triggered, which is our test runner. So let's simply go ahead and do that. So let's simply go back to our VS Code, right? Then inside our VS Code, if we go to package.json, right, under watch, right, where we had said watch for in our scripts tag, let's simply go ahead and add a test tag, right? So let's simply go ahead and say test. So for our testing, in this case, we're going to use Jest. So once you've done that, you can quickly go ahead and save this up. You can actually see that we have installed all the dependencies that we need in our developer dependencies. So you can actually see that we now have Jest, we now have React test renderer, and then our React testing library. So once you have installed those three dependencies, we can actually go ahead and start our unit testing. So for our unit testing, the first component that we want to test out is the layout component. So to begin with your unit testing, one thing that you need to make sure is you actually need to go ahead and create a folder inside. Remember, we had put all our components inside folders. So I'm simply going to write unit tests for these different folders. For this layout folder, you simply go ahead and create a folder called __test, then __, like so. Because when Jest runs, it actually looks for this folder inside our root component of our front-end application. So it will either look for the test folder. Once it has found it, then it will run everything that is an extension of test.js, right? So in this case, in this folder, let's now simply go ahead and create a new file called header.test.js, like so. All right, so once you've done that, you are pretty much you've pretty much configured everything, right? So what we need right now for our testing, let me simply go ahead and bring in the imports that we need for our testing. So for the imports, the first thing that we need to bring in is we need to bring in React, right? And then the next thing that we need to bring in is we need to bring in our React testing library, right? So from our React testing library, I'm simply bringing in the act function, helper, which is used to actually go ahead and paint our DOM, and then the render is also used to paint the DOM as well, and then the cleanup, which I'm going to use for our context management, right? And then for so we don't need a button. So the next thing that I probably need is I need to import the header. So let's simply go ahead and say import header from, right? So I'll import the header component from my header. So once I've done this, then I'll import the renderer, which we are going to use for our snapshot testing. So we simply go ahead and look what snapshot testing is. So for every test, you need to make sure that you do some sort of cleanup, because we actually want to say each and every time we run our test, we want to be able to actually go ahead and clean up our DOM. So to do that, use a method called after each, right? So this after each method, it takes this cleanup function. So this cleanup helper method that we have. So once you have done this, what happens is each and every time we write our tests, when our test completes, the Jest will automatically go ahead and trigger this after each method, which will actually go ahead and do some cleanup in terms of removing our component and all our elements in our DOM. So once you've done that, we are done with our context management. Then the next thing that we need to do is to run the tests themselves. So to run the tests, we're going to use a method called it, right? So inside this method, this is where we simply go ahead and write our unit testing. So I'm simply going to say it renders the header component. This is just a description for a test. It renders the header component, let's say without crashing. So once I've done that, this it method, it takes a callback, right? So inside this component callback, this is where we need to put we need to actually go ahead and paint our component and write our assertions. So in this case, remember, we are simply going to use render, because remember I brought in a render from our React testing library. So let's simply go ahead and say render. So this render, it actually takes the component. So in this case, the component that we have is called header, right? So once I've done that, is I've painted our header with the render function. So if I run this component right now, it's supposed to run this one test that we have. So to run the test, we simply go ahead and say npm test, like so, and then our Jest test runner will be fired, right? So once the test runner is fired, it will simply go ahead and runs the single test that we have so far inside the single.js. So as you can see, header.js. So as you can see, the header.test.js has been run and it has passed, right? So which means we are on the right track. So the next thing that we need to do is, remember for our header, remember our header was actually taking some prop, right? So which means each and every time we run our unit testing for our header, we need to actually make sure that that prop is being taken care of. So to do that, the next thing that we can actually go ahead and do is inside our render method, we can actually go ahead and say const, right? And we use this structuring and we go ahead and pull a container, right? So it's called container. So the render actually has some helper functions that you can use to actually go ahead and write our sessions. So in this case, I'm simply going to pull the header, right? So what I want to assert here, to write my assertions, use a keyword called a helper function called expect, right? So I'll say expect, right? So inside this expect, this is where I can actually go ahead and write the assertions that I need to do, right? So in this case, I'm expecting the container to have a text content. So in this case, I can say container dot, it's container dot text content, right? So I'm expecting the text content inside this component to be, right? So remember, for header.js, we had a default prop that was being passed called user registration. So let me simply go ahead and copy this and let me close this up, right? Code user registration like this, right? So this is how you actually go ahead and write your assertions. You use the keyword expect, and then this actually takes the component, or it takes the DOM element, and then you write your assertions. So in this case, I'm going to use the to-be function, and then we pass our string. So we're expecting this element, right, in this container to have actually a text content called user registration. So if you save this up, and let's simply go ahead and run our test. So if you say npm test like this, it's supposed to run our test. All right. So as you can see, it has run our tests and our test has passed, right? So which means one thing that you need to make sure when you are writing this unit testing, you need to do what we call a rule of thumb. So you need to actually go ahead and mess around with this. So if I say user registrations, and we know that it's expecting user registration, our test is supposed to fail. So let's simply go ahead and rerun the test. So if I say npm test, right, our tests is supposed to fail because here I've said user registrations instead of user registration. So you can actually see that it's now saying we have one failed. So if you go to the components, it's now saying this is where our failure is on this to be. So it's saying it's expecting it's expecting user registrations, because here we're expecting to have user registrations, but it has received a default prop code user registration, right? So which means you need to make sure that you do a little bit of messing around with these tests so that you can make sure that your component is working as expected. So we are done with this test. So the next test that we need to do for the header component is we want to test to say if it renders the header component with a prop, right? So remember, our header component is taking a prop called title. So we need to make sure that the component is actually rendering with that prop. So let me simply go ahead and declare the component, the prop called title. So for this prop, I'm simply going to say, let's say my header, like so, right? So inside, once I've declared my header, let me simply go ahead and render our component. So to render the component, I can simply go ahead and use the destructuring method that we did, right? So I will say container, right? I'm pulling container from this render method. Then I'll simply go ahead and pass my component like so. So once I've passed the component, the next thing that I probably need to do is I need to pass the prop element. So in this case, the prop that we're expecting is we're expecting it to have a title prop, right? So for this prop, let me simply go ahead and put this title, right? So for my assertions, remember for the default, it was using user registration, but in this case, we have passed the prop called my header. So for my assertions, I'm simply going to say expect, right? Then I'll say container dot text content, right? I'm expecting it to be, right? To be my header. So I can simply go ahead and pass the string, or let me simply go ahead and pass the variable itself, title, like this, right? So I can simply pass the string, or I can directly pass the variable, right? So if I save this out, and if I simply go ahead and clear my terminal and I rerun my test, right? It's supposed to run our test, and this test is supposed to pass because we have our header component is also expecting a prop. If we don't pass it, it will use the default, but in this case it has used this header prop. So if I simply go ahead and mess this up, let's say I put something here which is not the one that we want, right? And simply go ahead and rerun the test, right? Our test is supposed to fail, right? So you can actually see that our test has failed here. So it has received my header, yet it's expecting this. So you just need to make sure that you mess up with your tests so that you can make sure that all your assertions are working as expected. So the next test that we now want to look at is called Snapshot Tests. So what Snapshot Tests are is they actually allow us to make sure that our UI or our user interface doesn't change unexpectedly. So let me simply go ahead and say it matches snapshot like this. So this is going to take a callback function. So what I'm going to do for this snapshot test, I'm going to define something called tree. Then in this case, I'm going to use a renderer, right? For my snapshot test, I'm going to use a renderer from React test renderer. So I'll say renderer, right? So dot create, so that I can actually go ahead and render my component, right? So in this case, I want to render my header component, right? Like so. Then I want to convert this to JSON, right? So that it will be a JSON object. So what this command does is it will actually convert our header component into a JSON object. So what I want to test here is I'll simply go ahead and write my assertion. So I'll say expect, right? So I'm expecting tree to match snapshot like this, right? So what this does is each and every time, what React does is it will actually go ahead and look for our component, and then it will say whatever the component that we are rendering, is it matching the snapshot. So if I save this, right, and I go ahead and run the test, right, so if I say npm test like so, what's going to happen is our Jest test runner is going to create a snapshot folder inside this test. So once it has created a snapshot folder, the next time that maybe a user goes ahead and change our components, let's say we don't want them to change our component and somehow they made a mistake, or be it intentional or not an intentional change, the next time that they change the component, our test is supposed to fail because it won't match this. So for example, if I go under test snapshots, right, and it has created a JavaScript object of our component, right, this header, user registration header, right? So which means if I go ahead and say, let's say there was an unexpected change, so let's say instead of header, let me say maybe I put headers here. So the next time I run the test again, the test is supposed to fail because it's expecting a header section. It's expecting this to be header, not headers. So we can actually see that our snapshot here has failed, right? Because for example, the class name, we had header before when we ran the snapshot test, now it's headers. So this can actually make us, the snapshot tests are good because they actually make us able to detect changes in our code, be it intentional or not intentional changes, right? So the next test that we'll probably want to look at is, we now want to look at our register user component. So let's simply go ahead and close this up, right? So the register user component, let's create a folder. So remember, we create a folder called test, right? So inside this folder test, this is where I'll create my new file, register user.test.js. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to copy all this, right? Then I'll bring it in here. So instead of importing header, this time I'm importing register user, right? So let's import register user component, right? So I'm going to keep this as is. So here I need to put after each for our state management, so that we can make sure that each and every time our Jest runs our tests, it always goes ahead and tear up the component from our DOM. So here I'll say it renders without crashing, right? So I need to first test my component itself, right, so that we can make sure that it does not have any issues. So here I will say register user, right? So if I save this up, right, and I go to my terminal, so let me quickly clear my terminal, and then I run npm test, right? So it's supposed to run the tests, including this one. All right, so you can see all the tests have passed. So the next thing that we now want to test from our component is, we now want to test the states of our input field. So remember, from our component we had different input fields, right? So we now want to test if those inputs field are changing in state. So normally when you want to test for state, right, in a React component, you normally use enzyme, because enzyme actually gives you it allows you to test states and props from our component. But in this case, I'm not going to use enzyme. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to test the after effects of these changes in states of our input fields, right? So using events. So the way I'm going to do it is, so I'm going to call it it updates on, sorry, some codes. So I'll say it updates on name change, because in first of all I want to test if it updates whenever I change the name input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to render my component. So in this case I'm going to say const. So I'm going to say const, let's say use, right, then is equals to render. I'm going to use my render. Then I'll render my component, right? So I'll render my component like so, right? So the next thing that I'll need to do is for me to get the actual input. So for example, if I may go ahead and navigate to register user, for me to get the actual, right, to get the actual input, right, because there are different input here. There's a name input, there's a surname, email, and etc. So for me to get the name input, remember in my inputs we had put a placeholder for each and every input. So remember for name we had name as a placeholder. We had put some placeholders for each and every input. So here I'm going to use there's a helper function that we can get from the render called get by placeholder text. So which means I want to get by this placeholder. So right, so for my, instead of saying utils here, what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to pull the get, right? So if I say from the render, you can actually see that there are quite helper methods that we can use here: get by test ID, by row, by etc. So in this case I want to say get by placeholder input. So I want to use this one, get by placeholder text, right? So which means when my component is rendered, right, I want to use this helper function to get the exact input that I want to write my assertion on. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to define my input. So I'm going to say const input is equal to, then I'll say get by placeholder text, right? So in this case, the placeholder that I need for my name is called name, right? So once I've done that, it means I've pulled out the name input field, right? Then the next thing that I need to do is I want to fire an event. So the event that I'm going to fire is I want to fire an on-change event. So for you to be able to fire an event, right, you simply go ahead and pull something called fire event from our React testing library. So what I'm going to do is, let me go ahead and simulate the event. So I'll simply say fire event dot change. So remember, I want to run an change event, right, on my input, which I've pulled, which I've got by name, right? Then the next thing that I need to do is I need to put the target. So I'll say target, then I'll put the value, right? So in this case, the value that I want to handle change to update my state on, let's say, for example, I say John. So if I do this, right, so if I do this, it will handle my on-change event on my input field. So the next thing that I need to do is I probably need to write my assertion query. So I'm simply going to say expect, right? So I'm simply going to say expect, then the input, I'm expecting the input dot value, right, to be right? So this time I'm going to use to be, right, in this case to be John, right? So if I go ahead and save this up, right, and run npm test, npm test like this, what we're expecting is we're expecting it to fire an on-change event on our input field, right? Then be able to actually have this John as an expected value. So register user. So right now we are having an error. So what is it saying? All right, so it's probably saying the register user component is expecting a prop called add user, right? So which is a callback function. So if you go to our register user, see, so if you go to our register user, so remember we had defined our prop types here and we said add user is required, our callback function. So the way I'm going to simulate this is I'm going to write something that is called mock. All right. So what mock does is it allows us to simulate some callback functions. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to say const add user is equals to jest, right? So I'm going to use jest for our mockup. So right now I'm mocking, or I'm mocking a callback function called add user. So this is how you mock a callback function. So remember, our register user is expecting a prop called add user. So I'll simply go ahead and pass our add user as a prop, like so. So this is now a callback function. So if I go ahead and clear my terminal and I rerun my test, right, it's supposed to pass. So mocking, this is something that you need to note, that each and every time you have a callback function, jest. Now remember, we are now using jest, right? Not Rest texting library. Remember, we had installed jest, so jest allows you to write some mockup functions. So this is how you do a mockup, right? So what's going on? So for some reason it hasn't updated my change, right? So what I'm going to do is, at times it does that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run npm test, right? So this time I'm going to say update. So I'm going to update my snapshot and as well as my see, it renders without crashing. Oh, I see. So I think this component is expecting as well a mockup function. So I think we're probably going to edit. So let's see. So let's add this. I forgot to add this. So at times it does that. At times it works without you having to put some props, and at times it doesn't. So when it doesn't, to be safe, just make sure that you put all the props that are expected. So simply mock up this first test, right? Terminal. So no need to run the update to update the snapshots. Let me simply go ahead and run npm test. All right, so now as you can probably see, we no longer have any complaints from our jest. So the next thing that I need to do is I want to write assertions for the rest of our fields, the email, the email, username, etc. So what I'm going to do, instead of doing all this, right, for each and every test, instead of repeating this, right, I'm going to do a little bit of composition here. So I'm going to create a function called setup. So I'll say setup like this. Right? So this setup function is going to take a placeholder, right? It's going to take a placeholder and the value that we want to do in change event. So it's going to be a callback function. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to say, so instead of doing this, so what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to pull this. So let me pull everything here. So I'm going to pull this, right? So I'll put it here, this. So right, this is what we need, which is fine. So now we have rendered our component. So the next thing that I probably need to do is to define our input. So I'll say input. So in fact, let me simply go ahead and copy this, right? Because we now want to use our composition so that we can so here, instead of saying name, right, I'm going to use the value. I'm actually going to pass the value, the string that will pass here. So the next thing that we need to do is to fire an event. So I'm simply going to copy this, right, for fire an event. Then I'll paste it here. So for our event, we are saying so here we are saying get by placeholder. So the placeholder is this, right? So I want to get the placeholder. Then here for the value, I will simply say value, like so. So it will use this value. So once I have triggered my own change, so the next thing that I need to do is I need to input dot value, like so. So my function is going to return the value, so that next time when I simply go ahead and write my test, for example, let's say I want to write another test called SNM, change test, right? So the next time I'm going to do this, I'm simply going to use my composition. So the way I'm going to use my composition, I'm simply going to say const, right? So I want to define my value. So in this case, the value is equals to setup, right? Because remember, our setup function is going to return a value. So I'm going to say setup, right? Then I'm going to pass my placeholder. So in this case, my placeholder is called SNM. We get SNM as a placeholder. Then the value, let's say is the value for my SNM. Then the next thing that I probably need to do is to write my assertion. So for my assertion, I'm simply going to say expect. I'm going to expect the value that we have got. So in this case, I'm expecting the value to be, let's say, like this. So through composition, you can actually see that it actually saves us time in terms of. So I need to close this up. In terms of writing our test. So let's simply go ahead and run this. So simply test. So while this is running, I can simply go ahead and copy this and do the rest. Just those two of them. So here I'll test the email, right? So I'll say email, then I'll say admin at gmail.com, then I'll copy the value. So I'm expecting it to be here. So I'm done with this test. So the other one is username, right? I want to test the on change for username. So here the placeholder is called username. So I'll simply say username. Then for the username, I'll say, let's say, Johnny, right? So I'll say Johnny. Then I'll write the assertion here. So I copy this. So copy it. Okay, like so. Then I save. Then I create my terminal. Then I test. All right, so our test has passed and we do not have any issues. So for still, whilst we are still on our register user component, the next that I want to write is I will now want to simulate our mock and our callback function for the button. So remember, in our register user component, we had a button, right? So for that button, I'm simply going to search for that button and write an on click event, because remember, each and every time we hit the submit, it's supposed to post the data to our app.js, and then it will then actually go ahead and save the data to our Spring Boot REST API. So this test I'm going to say on submit. So I'll say on submit. Add user as a callback, right? So remember, so if we are to go to the register user, right? So this is the register user. Remember, we had this button, right? So this is the button that we have defined, right? It's called submit, right? So each and every time we hit the submit button, what's supposed to happen is on our form, right? It's supposed to run this on submit method, and it's supposed to run our on submit callback function. So when this on submit callback function is run, it will then call this add user and then set the state. So this is what we want to test, right? So let's simply go ahead and do that. So I'll simply say I'll put my callback here. So what you want to do is the first thing that we need to do is we need to mock our add user. So I will say add user. This is our callback function. So let's say just.fn. So right now I'm now mocking. I've created a fake add user callback function, right? So the next thing that we probably need to do is we now want to render our component, right? So as we're going to render our component, right? So let me simply go ahead and render our component. So in this case, I'm going to render register. I'm going to render register user. So remember our register user takes an add user component, right? Sorry, an add user prop, which is a callback function. Right? So here I will say add user, like so. So this time, what I need to do is I need to search, right? I need in my component, I need to look for this button, right? So for this button, because this is the button that you want to simulate, you want to press this, you want to write an event that is going to simulate an on click event on this button. So I'm going to find it by this text called submit. So again, the render API, here's a get by text, right? Here's a get by text, right? That allows us to search for a specific text. So in this case, I'm simply going to say const button is supposed to get by text. Supposed to get by text. So the text that we want to get by is called submit, right? Is it? Yeah, submit. So if you go to our button, right, is submit. So we want to search for this button by this text called submit. So the next thing that I need to do is I probably need to write our event to simulate our event. So to simulate our event, I'm simply going to say button, then I'll say dispatch event, like so. So what this dispatch event is going to take a new mouse event. So I'm going to say new mouse event, which is going to perform a click function like this, and on click event. Then once I've done that, right now we have clicked our button. So once we have clicked our button, so remember, if I go to register user, once I click the button, it's supposed to go to this on submit function, right, in our prop. So remember, we cannot have access using React testing library unless you're using Enzyme. You cannot have access to all these methods, like all these custom methods in our component. But what can have access is the after effects. So in this case, remember, the after effects that we can actually catch here is our prop, right, which is called add user. So when it goes to on submit, right, it's going to call this add user callback function, right? It's going to be called. So this is what we want to test. So for my assertion, I'm simply going to say expect, right? So I'm simply going to say expect add user, our callback function that we just mocked, to have called one time. So we have been called times like this. So I'm expecting this to have been called one times the moment we simulate this. So let me simply go ahead and save this, clear my terminal, and then I'll run my test. All right, so as you can see, all my tests is passed. So let me try to mess with this. Let's say true here, expecting it to have been called one time. So let me say true and see what happens. All right, so we can see our test has failed, right? So it's saying it's expecting one and yet we've passed two. So we need to make sure that each and every time you run your assertions, just put something that is wrong so that you make sure that your assertions are working. So the last test that I need to write for our component is the snapshot test, so that we can actually make sure that our UI doesn't change unexpectedly. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to say const tree again is equals to renderer. So we have a renderer dot create, then pass my register user component, right? So once I passed it like so, then I'll say I'll write my assertion, So I'll say expect tree like so remember this one takes a callback function called add user. So I'll simply say add user equals to, then we are mocking just dot function. So this is how you mock Jest. So I'll say add user, then I'll call our callback function add user like so. I'll close this up, save, then I'll clear the terminal. So once I run my test, it's supposed to create a snapshot folder. All right. So as you can see, it has it has passed our test, right? So it has run our snapshot test and created a test and etc. And it has passed. So the next text that we need to do is we now want to test our button. So for our button, I think I'm going to refactor our code. I'm going to add this button inside a so I'm simply going to create a folder, right? So I'm simply going to create a folder called button. So I need to put this button here. Let's see. Then I'll move it to this, right, so that I can actually go ahead and create another folder. So make sure that when you do something like this, you actually go ahead and refactor your code so that it doesn't kill our code. So I'll say button.test.js, right? So for our button, so here it is, yes, it is updated. So simply save, right? So this is where our button is called. So for our button, so let me close this up. For our button, let's go ahead and copy this boilerplate code. So I'll paste it inside my button. So I'll simply bring it in. So I'll say button, my button here. Then I'll say it renders without rushing. Then this is going to take a callback. So I'm simply going to say, let me simply directly. So I'm going to render my button, right? So I'll render my button like so. So the next test, I'm not going to run this to save time. The next test that we need, so for a button, okay, so all right, so maybe let me simply so let me simply go ahead and say const, right? So what I want to do is I want to test whether our button is this submit text. So to do that, I'm simply going to pull something called container. So the reason why I'm using different helper methods is so that you get familiar with these different components that we can use for render. Because if you are using the test utils and etc., they do act and they also use something called containers and etc. But you can actually see that with React testing library, it has bundled all that into one good package. So that's why I'm using this render method. So for this one, let me simply write my assertion. So what I'm simply expecting here is I'm expecting the container, right, to have a text content, right, text content to be, right? So I want the text content to be, I'm expecting it to be like so. So this is how you write your assertion. This is one way of doing it. So the last test I need to do is I need to write test, right? So it finishes snapshot, then I'll put my callback, then I'll say const free. So use the renderer, and then I'll use the create, then I'll render my component to my DOM, so it's called button. So then I'll say my assertion, so here it's expect, right? So it's expect, I'm expecting tree to match this snapshot. So this is a little bit of so it's a little bit repetitive, just that you know it will actually go ahead and do the idea. So I'll simply npm test this. All right, so our test here is successfully passed, right? So the next test that we need to do is we now want to test our user component, sorry, our users component, right? So inside this users, I'm going to create a folder called test, right? I'll set this up, then I'm simply going to say users test.js. So I'm simply going to copy everything, right? Then I'll paste it here. So for my users component, I'm simply going to say it renders without crashing, right? So I'll simply say render for the users component. So here I need to import the users. So is it users? Yes, it's users. So then I'll set this up and I'll write my test. All right, so you can probably see that our test has failed, right? So the reason why our test has failed is our users component is expecting an array of users as a prop, so that you can actually go ahead and run this map function. So that's the first thing. So the second thing that it's expecting, it's probably expecting the add user prop. So cannot read property of map. So that was the first one. Sorry. So it's expecting a prop called remove user. So if we go to users, right? So if I go down here under props, it's expecting a users, an array of users, and the remove user prop. So let's simply go ahead and mock our component. So the first thing that I need to do is I'm simply going to create remove user, right? So I'm simply going to say jest.fn. So I've mocked our callback function called remove user. So the next thing that we need to mock is the array of users, right? So for this array of users, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to create an array of users, right? So for this array of users, it's going to have an ID, one, right? So it will have a name. So it will have a name. So in this case, I will say Peter. So here I will say Peter, right? Then so it also have a surname, right? So I will say Parker. What's going on today? So I'll say Pete as a username. Then the email, expecting to have an email. So for the email, I'll say gmail.com, like so. So this is the user that is expecting. So let me just go ahead and copy and paste this a couple of times. So I'll copy this. Right, so this one I'm going to say this is user number 2. So this is user number 3. So I need a comma, right? So this one, let's say John. Let's say Johnny. Let's say John, right? So the last user I'm going to call Mary. Let's say Bobbins. The username will say Mary. it's the email, right? So once you've done that, is the next thing that we need to do is we want to actually go ahead and mock this callback function. So remember, each and every time we get a list of users, right, those users will be coming from somewhere, right? So in our case, we can mock the users, for example, to come from a REST API, where these users actually coming from a REST API as a promise, so that we need to access them as promises. So with Jest allows us to actually go ahead and write a promise-based mock using something called mock implementation. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say simulate, right? I'm going to comment this and async, right? So we want to simulate in a synchronous call so that our users component will receive a list of users from, let's say, a promise based response, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say global. So the way I'm going to simulate is I'm going to say global dot fetch, right? Say just, right? So we need our callback function. So just dot fn. Right? Then I'll use something called mock. Mock implementation, like so. So this one is going to check an arrow function. So inside this arrow function, I'm simply going to say promise, right, dot resolve, because we are saying our callback function, when you say get users, it's going to return a promise, right? So if it's going to return a promise, I'm going to resolve that promise, right? So I'm going to say this promise is going to be Json. Say promise dot resolve. Then we get our users, like so. All right. Okay. So here it's global. So there's no space here. It's global dot fetch. Probably need to do it like so. Right. So to make this asynchronous, I can simply go ahead and say await here. Right. Okay. Or let me remove await. So let me do it like so. So what you need to do is our component is expecting a users object, array of objects. So I'll say users, right? Then the next thing that it's expecting is expecting our callback function called remove user, like so. So once you've done that, the next thing that we need to do is to write our assertions, right? So the way I'm going to write them is I'm going to say const, right? So in this case, I'm going to use my container because I now want to query our DOM element that would have been painted with this list of users. So I'm going to pull something called container like we did before, right? So for my assertions, I'm going to say expect, right? So I'm going to expect, our container text content. So I want our container to have a text container text content, right? In this case, I'm going to use something called to contain users. Then I'll simply put the first users. So first user. So in this case, I'm going to say to contain user. Right, so this is my first assertion, so I can simply go ahead and write the rest of the assertions. So I'm expecting it to have an email, a name, surname. So we can write it as texts, but here I'm just pulling in from the object. So I can say username. So you can mock the rest, the second user, the third user. So let's say, for example, the last user, surname. Then this is the first user. This is the second user's username. Okay, we can actually do that. Right, so once you've done that, the next thing is to probably test. So I'll take this up, save this, and I'll say test. Right, so our test is failing. So let's see, where is it failing? So here it's saying it's not identifying container. Why is not? Oh, here would misspelled container here, so that's why it's not finding container. So let's run it. Sorry about that. So npm test. So while it's still running, the last test that we need to do is I'll simply say probably done for the most part. Something else that we test. Alright, so all our tests is passed, right? So the next thing is I need to mock this, right? So let me simply go ahead and copy this. So I'll copy the remove user prop, right? Then the next prop that I probably need to do is these users. So in this case, these users, I'm going to pass an empty array, because at times when you render a component, at times it might not have objects, so we need to test that as well. So here I'm going to use the renderer create. Then I'll simply use the users object. Close this up. So the users object is expecting a users, right? A users prop. So it's expecting a users prop. So we simply call users prop. Then remove user, right? Remove user. So we simply put it here. Right. So the next thing that I probably need to do is I'll say this one dot to JSON. I want it to be a JSON object so that I can actually read it. Then I'll finally write my assertion. So I'll say expect free dot h snapshot. Okay. So once I've done that, then we can simply write test. Sorry, there it's free. Set t. Set this. Alright, so our test has failed. Probably it's not recognizing this. So let me rerun it. Alright, so our test has passed. So we have written our snapshot test. So the next, probably the last test that we need. So the last test that we need is we need to test this user info. So what I'm simply going to do is say test, right? Then I'll create a new file called user info.test.js. So for my user info.test.js, I'm simply going to copy type it. Right, so here I'm going to import user info. Right, so I'm going to import our component user info, like so. So the next test that I need to write is without crashing. Right, so let's simply go ahead and say render user. So let's simply quickly check out the user info. So let's see which props it's expecting. So it's expecting the remove user and the user object itself. So let's simply go ahead and write that. So let's simply go ahead and mock the remove user. So mock it using Jest fn, right, and then const expecting a user, so expecting a user object. So I'm going to leave it as empty now. Then I'll simply pass remove user. So user. Then I'll also pass the user component. All right, so I'll simply pass the user component like so. So what you can do is, if you want to mock this user object, you can actually go ahead and do that. So you do the conversion that we did before, right? So and also, so let me just do it. So instead of saying user, what I'm going to say is I'm going to create, because I want to show you something, what last concept. So I'm simply going to say fake user. So this is going to be an empty of 1. The name, I'm going to call it John. Then for email. So let me simply this. All right, so once I've done that, the next thing is I now want to simulate my asynchronous call. So what I can simply do is I can say global. So instead of retyping everything, let me simply go ahead and grab this. Right, so I'm going to grab this, still code from here, then I'll put it here. Right, so what you want to resolve this time is simply a single user, like so, right? So this is the single user that we are. So it's not user, I've called it user, right? So this is what we are resolving, right? So remember, since it's returning in a promise, right? The next thing that I need to do is when I render this component, right? When I render this component, I want to make sure that all the related components, like events, I want to act on it, right? So I'm going to write an await. So the way you can actually do that is, if you want to use the asynchronous version of rendering this component, to paint the DOM, you use something called act, right? So I'm going to use something called act, right? So what this act is, it takes a callback function. Then inside this act, you can actually go ahead and render. You can actually go ahead and render our DOM like so. So the next thing that I need to do is I want to run this asynchronously. So I'm going to say await, because I want our component to be printed once to be painted to the DOM once we have got this user object. So if I say await here, so remember, if we say await in async, right, like so. So I'll say async, right? So that this will be printed like so. So remember, if you have an await async, the next thing that you need to do is probably to make your whole function in asynchronous function like so. So I'll do it like so. So my function is now asynchronous. So I'm now awaiting this. So the next thing that I can probably do is I'll say utils, right? So I'm going to say utils, because remember, for my assertions, I'm going to do them outside of this async await, outside of this act. So I'm simply going to say utils. Then for these utils, what I will then do is I'll simply go ahead and pull the container from our utils. So I'm simply going to say container, right? So I'm now pulling the container from this utils. So I'm simply pulling the container from this utils like so. So once I've done that, then I think I can now go ahead and write my assertions, right? So to write my assertions, I'm actually going to copy this, right? Then I can write them here. So what I will say it to contain, so in this case is now a single user. So I'll say user dot. So I'm expecting my rendered component to have a name, right? So in this case it's name. So I will write an assertion for the surname, right? So let me copy paste this. So email. So I will say email. So once I've done that, I can simply go test through npm test. So it's failing somewhere. So user info render user. So here is no longer user. Change it to fake user. So alright. So let me do this. Let's say npm test. Alright. So while this is running, the last test that we probably need to write is, remember we had those two icons, for example the delete icon. So we now want to test this delete icon so that whenever it's pressed it will actually fire anywhere. So I will say so what I'm going to say is I'll say it click delete user. So our test failed. So why is it not failed? Why is it failed this time? Utils is not defined. So I can say let utils. So I can define it outside here. So all right. So what I want to simulate is I want to simulate that delete icon button, right? So the way I'm going to do it is I'm simply going to copy this, right? I'm going to copy this. And I'll paste it here, right? So in terms of rendering, what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to render user info, right? So my user info is going to have a user called user, right? Then it also has a remove user callback prop. So I'll simply say remove user. So what I want to do here is I want to get the label of our delete button. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to go ahead to the users info. Then I want to put a label text here. So the label text that I'm going to put here is called area. So I'm going to say area label, right? So I'm going to say area label is equals to delete Because remember, the reason why I'm putting a label here is our buttons do not have a text or anything, it's just an icon. So for us to be able to identify the exact button, I'm going to use a label for that, right? So once I've done that, I can now always go ahead text get by label. So I can simply go ahead and say const, right? So I'll say get, right? So I want to get by label text like so. So get by label text. So I want to get so it's not all, it's simply get by label text, right? So I want to get the button by label text. So what I will do is I will say const delete button is equals to get by label text. Then we'll simply pass the label. Label is delete button. So once we've got the delete label, the next thing that we need to do is want to fire an event. So to fire an event, again, I'm going to use the act method, right, so that we can actually go ahead and perform our events handling. So the way I'm going to do it, I'm simply going to say delete button dot dispatch event. So in this case, I'm going to select a mouse event. So this mouse event is going to be a click event. Then since I'm putting it under act, I need something called bubbles. Then I'll say right. So once I've finished writing my act, the next thing that I need to do is probably write my assertion. So to write my assertion, I'll simply say expect remove user, right? So I'm expecting to remove user to get code times. So how many times? In this case, once. All right, so once you've done that, guys, we are probably done our click event. So let me simply go ahead and save this up. Test like so. All right, so as you can see, all our tests has passed, right? And which means everything has passed. So this tutorial has been long enough, guys. So this is what I want to just show you, how you can actually go ahead and write your unit testing for your components using React testing library and Jest. So for the most part, this is how you do it without using Enzyme. So we are just simply using React testing library and Jest. So this is how you do it, guys. So if you've been following this tutorial, guys, thank you so much for following. I know that this has been a journey and this has been a long tutorial, and thank you for supporting the channel. So if you have any questions, just please let me know in the comments down below. And if you find this tutorial helpful, just please press a like and don't forget to subscribe. So thank you, guys. I've been Tafazwa, and see you in the next one.